They told me I was too old to work here. But now they need me back? What happened? I'm spilling the tea on why they came crawling back and how I'm not letting them get away with it. The irony is almost too delicious to believe. 3 months ago, I was escorted out of Meridian Financial Solutions like some kind of criminal, clutching a cardboard box filled with my personal belongings while my former colleagues avoided eye contact. Today, my phone won't stop ringing with calls from the same executives who showed me the door. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start from the beginning. My name is Jessica Palmer, and until recently, I was the Senior Risk Assessment Manager at Meridian Financial Solutions. At 42, I thought I had found my career home. I'd been with the company for 8 years, watching it grow from a scrappy startup to a major player in the financial services industry. I'd helped build their risk management protocols from the ground up, created training programs that were adopted company-wide, and mentored dozens of junior analysts who went on to become successful in their own right. But apparently, none of that mattered when the new CEO, Marcus Brennan, decided to revitalize the company with what he called fresh perspectives and innovative approaches. What he really meant was getting rid of anyone over 40 to make room for recent graduates who would work for half the salary and twice the hours without questioning authority. The writing was on the wall for months before they actually pulled the trigger. It started with subtle comments about digital natives and adapting to new technologies. Then came the restructuring announcements, the voluntary early retirement packages, and the sudden influx of 20-something consultants who spoke in buzzwords and treated every conversation like a TED Talk. I watched as my colleagues began disappearing one by one. First, it was Tom Richardson from accounting, who'd been with the company since its inception. Then Maria Santos from HR, who knew every employee's birthday and had single-handedly created the company culture we all loved. Each departure was announced as a mutual decision or a new opportunity, but we all knew what was really happening. I thought I was safe, I was good at my job, maybe even irreplaceable. My risk assessment models had saved the company millions of dollars over the years. I had relationships with key clients that went back nearly a decade. I knew where all the bodies were buried, metaphorically speaking, and I understood the intricate web of regulations that governed our industry better than anyone else in the building. I was wrong. The meeting was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in March. I should have known something was up when Marcus asked me to come to his office with Linda Chen from HR. Linda couldn't meet my eyes as she shuffled through her papers, and Marcus had that practiced sympathetic expression that executives perfect for delivering bad news. "Jessica," he began, his voice dripping with false concern, "we need to talk about your role here at Meridian." I felt my stomach drop, but I kept my expression neutral. "What about it?" "Well, as you know, we're going through a period of significant transformation. The financial industry is evolving rapidly, and we need to ensure our team is positioned to meet the challenges of tomorrow." I wanted to laugh at the corporate speak, but I could see where this was heading. "And?" Marcus leaned back in his chair, trying to look casual. "We've decided to restructure the risk management department. We're looking for someone with a more contemporary approach to risk assessment, someone who can bring fresh ideas and modern methodologies to the role." "I see." I kept my voice steady. "And you don't think I can provide that?" Linda finally spoke up, reading from what was clearly a prepared script. "Jessica, your contributions to Meridian have been invaluable. However, we feel that the company would benefit from a different perspective in this critical role." "A younger perspective, you mean?" Marcus's face flushed slightly. "Age has nothing to do with this decision. It's about fit and future vision." I almost laughed out loud. "Marcus, I created the risk management protocols that are still in use today. I've adapted to every regulatory change, every market shift, every technological advancement that's come our way. What exactly about my approach is outdated?" "Jessica, please don't make this more difficult than it needs to be." His tone had shifted from sympathetic to slightly irritated. "We're prepared to offer you a generous severance package, and we'll provide excellent references for your job search." That's when I knew for certain this wasn't about performance or vision or any of the other euphemisms they were throwing around. This was about age, plain and simple. They wanted to replace me with someone younger, cheaper, and more malleable. How generous, I asked, deciding to play along. Linda slid a folder across the desk. 6 months' salary, continued health insurance for the same period, and will even cover outplacement services to help you find your next opportunity. I opened the folder and scanned the documents. It was more than I'd expected, but not nearly enough to make up for what they were doing to me. And if I don't sign this, then we'll have to proceed with termination for cause, Marcus said, his mask finally slipping, which would mean no severance, no references, and a much more difficult transition. I looked at both of them. These people I'd worked alongside for years, and felt a cold fury settle in my chest. What cause? Performance issues, failure to adapt to new systems, inability to collaborate effectively with the new team structure. He rattled off the reasons like he'd been practicing them. We have documentation going back several months. I knew it was fabricated, but I also knew they'd been building their case carefully. In the current job market, fighting them would be expensive and time-consuming, with no guarantee of success. The smart play was to take the money and run. I'll need some time to review this with my attorney, I said, standing up. Of course, Linda said, looking relieved that I wasn't making a scene. But we'll need an answer by the end of the week. I walked out of that office with my head held high, but inside I was seething. They'd ambushed me, cornered me, and were essentially forcing me to sign away my right to fight back. But what choice did I have? The next few days were a blur of phone calls with lawyers, financial advisors, and job placement specialists. Everyone gave me the same advice: take the money and move on. Age discrimination was nearly impossible to prove. And even if I could prove it, the legal process would be lengthy and expensive. Better to cut my losses and find something else. So I signed the papers, I cleaned out my office, said goodbye to the colleagues who were brave enough to acknowledge my departure, and walked out of Meridian Financial Solutions for what I thought would be the last time. The job search was every bit as brutal as I'd expected. Despite my experience and track record, I found myself competing with candidates half my age who would work for half my salary. The few interviews I managed to get were superficial affairs where I could practically see the moment they decided I was too old, too expensive, or too set in my ways. One particularly memorable interview was with a startup run by a 28-year-old who kept talking about disrupting the traditional financial services model. When I asked about their risk management protocols, he waved his hand dismissively and said they preferred to move fast and break things. I wanted to explain that in financial services, breaking things meant losing other people's money and potentially going to prison. But I could tell he'd already written me off. After 2 months of rejections, I started to wonder if Marcus had been right. Maybe I was too old, too stuck in my ways, too unwilling to embrace the brave new world of fintech disruption. Maybe it was time to consider early retirement, to step aside and let the digital natives take over. But then I got a call that changed everything. It was a Thursday morning in June, and I was sitting in my home office, scrolling through job listings and trying to summon the energy to send out another round of applications. My phone rang, and I almost didn't answer when I saw the caller ID, Meridian Financial Solutions. Hello? I answered cautiously. Jessica, it's Linda Chen from Meridian. Do you have a few minutes to talk? I was so surprised I almost hung up. Linda, what do you want? I know this is awkward, but we have a situation here, and we could really use your help. I sat up straighter. What kind of situation? It's complicated. Could you possibly come in for a meeting? Today, if possible? I looked at my calendar, which was depressingly empty. I suppose I could. But Linda, if this is about some kind of consulting arrangement, I'm not interested in helping the company that fired me. Jessica, please, just hear us out. Things have changed since you left. Something in her voice made me curious despite myself. What do you mean, changed? I'd rather discuss it in person. Can you be here at 2? I agreed, mostly out of morbid curiosity. What could possibly have gone wrong in the 3 months since I'd left? The company had been performing well. Their new, fresh perspectives were supposedly revolutionizing their approach, and they had a whole team of bright young minds to solve any problems that arose. I dressed carefully for the meeting, choosing a sharp navy suit that made me feel powerful and professional. If they wanted to grovel, I was going to make sure I looked like someone worth groveling to. The Meridian offices looked different somehow. The energy that had always buzzed through the hallways seemed muted, and I noticed several empty desks that hadn't been there when I left. The cheerful artwork and motivational posters that had once adorned the walls looked faded and out of place. Linda met me at reception, and I was shocked by how tired she looked. The woman who had always been impeccably put together now had dark circles under her eyes and a nervous energy that made her hands shake as she led me to a conference room. "Thank you for coming," she said as we sat down. "I know this is strange, but we really need your help." "With what, exactly?" Before she could answer, the door opened and Marcus walked in, followed by David Kim, the chief financial officer. Both men looked like they'd aged years in the few months since I'd seen them. "Jessica," Marcus said, his voice lacking its usual confidence. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with us." I leaned back in my chair and crossed my arms. "I'm here. What do you want?" David cleared his throat. "We've encountered some challenges with the new risk management structure we implemented after your departure." "What kind of challenges?" Marcus shifted uncomfortably. "We may have moved too quickly in restructuring the department. The new team, while enthusiastic, has struggled with some of the more complex aspects of risk assessment." I felt a cold smile spread across my face. "Such as?" "Well," Linda consulted her notes. "There have been several incidents, some miscalculations in our derivatives portfolio, a few compliance issues with the new regulations that went into effect last month, and some client concerns about our risk assessment methodologies." "Client concerns?" David nodded grimly. "Henderson Industries is threatening to pull their account. They're questioning whether we understand the regulatory environment well enough to properly assess their risk profile." Henderson Industries was one of our biggest clients, representing nearly 15% of our total revenue. I'd worked with them for 6 years, building the customized risk models that had helped them navigate several major market downturns. And Morrison Financial Group has already moved their portfolio to Blackstone Associates. Marcus added, "They cited concerns about our inexperienced risk management team as their primary reason for leaving." Morrison Financial Group represented another 10% of our revenue. I'd personally walked them through the 2008 financial crisis, helping them avoid the catastrophic losses that had decimated their competitors. "I see," I said, trying to keep the satisfaction out of my voice. "And how much has this cost you so far?" The three of them exchanged glances. Finally, David spoke up. "We've lost approximately $43 million in assets under management, and we're projecting another $60 million in losses if we can't resolve these issues quickly. $103 million in 3 months." I'd warned them that replacing institutional knowledge with enthusiasm was a recipe for disaster. But they'd been so confident in their fresh perspectives that they hadn't listened. "That's unfortunate," I said. "But I'm not sure what it has to do with me." Marcus leaned forward. "Jessica, we know we made a mistake. The way we handled your departure was wrong, and we're prepared to make it right." "Make it right how?" "We want to offer you your old position back," Linda said. "Same title, same responsibilities, with a 20% salary increase and additional stock options." I stared at them for a long moment. "You want to offer me my old job back? The job you fired me from because I was too old and set in my ways?" "We may have been hasty in our assessment," Marcus said carefully. "We've come to realize that experience and institutional knowledge are more valuable than we initially thought." You've come to realize that losing $100 million in 3 months is more expensive than keeping one middle-aged employee on the payroll." David winced. "That's one way to put it." I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city skyline. Part of me wanted to tell them exactly what they could do with their job offer. They'd humiliated me, forced me out, and made me question my own worth. They'd sat in this very room and told me I was too old, too outdated, too irrelevant to be part of their bright new future. But another part of me was calculating. They were desperate, which meant I had leverage. They'd already lost over $100 million, and they were facing the possibility of losing even more. They needed me more than I needed them. 20% increase isn't enough, I said without turning around. We could go to 25, Marcus said quickly. I'm not talking about salary. I'm talking about the entire package. I want 40% more in base salary, double the stock options, and a seat on the executive committee. Jessica, that's my opening offer, I interrupted, turning back to face them. You can negotiate from there, or you can figure out how to explain another $60 million in losses to your board of directors. The room fell silent. Linda was scribbling notes. David was running calculations in his head, and Marcus was trying to figure out how to salvage his authority while giving me everything I wanted. There's also the matter of my team, I continued. I assume you've replaced the people you laid off with new hires. We've brought in some talented young professionals, Linda said carefully. I want final approval on all risk management hiring and firing decisions. If I'm going to be held responsible for the department's performance, I need to be able to choose my own team. Marcus bristled. We can't give you unilateral authority over personnel decisions. Then we don't have a deal. I picked up my purse. Thank you for the meeting, but I think I'll pass on your generous offer. Wait, David said as I headed for the door. What if we structured it as a consultation agreement? You could come back as a senior risk management consultant with authority over the department, but reporting directly to the executive committee. I paused with my hand on the door handle. A consultant position would give me even more leverage and flexibility than my old job. I'd be able to command higher rates, work on my own terms, and walk away whenever I wanted. 50% above my previous salary, converted to an hourly consulting rate, I said. Minimum guarantee of 30 hours per week, with full authority over risk management decisions. And I want my own office, not some cubicle in the corner. That's more than reasonable, Marcus said, looking relieved. When can you start? I'll need a few days to review the contract and wrap up some other commitments. I lied. I had no other commitments, but I wanted them to sweat a little longer. I can start Monday. Excellent. Linda will have the contracts ready by tomorrow afternoon. As I walked out of the building, I felt a satisfaction I hadn't experienced in months. They'd thrown me away like I was worthless, but now they were begging me to come back. The best part was that they knew they'd made a mistake, and they were going to pay dearly for it. The contracts were even better than I'd expected. Not only did they meet all my demands, but they'd included a clause that guaranteed my consulting agreement for a minimum of 2 years, with automatic renewal unless either party gave 6 months' notice. They'd also agreed to cover all my expenses, including a new laptop, phone, and access to the executive dining room. I spent the weekend preparing for my return. I reviewed all the changes that had been made to the risk management protocols in my absence, researched the new regulations that had gone into effect, and prepared a presentation on how to address the current client concerns. Monday morning, I walked into Meridian Financial Solutions wearing the same navy suit I'd worn to the meeting. This time, though, I felt like a conquering hero rather than a supplicant. Linda met me at reception and escorted me to my new office, which was significantly larger than my old one and had a much better view. Your first meeting is at 10, she said, handing me a schedule. The entire risk management team, plus Marcus and David. I looked at the schedule and smiled. They'd arranged for me to meet with the team they'd assembled to replace me. The bright young minds who were supposed to revolutionize their approach to risk assessment. This was going to be interesting. The conference room was packed when I arrived. I recognized a few faces from my previous tenure, but most of the team was new. They looked nervous, unsure of what to expect from the woman who'd been brought in to clean up their mess. Marcus stood up as I entered. Everyone, I'd like you to meet Jessica Palmer, our new senior risk management consultant. Jessica has extensive experience in this field and will be leading our efforts to address the current challenges we're facing. I set my laptop down and looked around the room. The average age couldn't have been more than 28, and I could see the confusion in their eyes. They'd been told they were the future of risk management, but now they were being supervised by someone from the past. Thank you, Marcus, I said, opening my laptop and connecting it to the projector. I've spent the weekend reviewing the current situation, and I have to say, I'm impressed by the scope of the challenges we're facing. A few people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The good news is that most of these issues are fixable, I continued, pulling up my presentation. The bad news is that fixing them is going to require some significant changes to our current approach. I spent the next hour walking through each of the major problems: the derivatives miscalculations, the compliance failures, the client concerns, and the methodology issues. For each problem, I explained not just what had gone wrong, but why it had gone wrong and how it could have been prevented. The fundamental issue, I concluded, is that risk management isn't just about running numbers through algorithms. It's about understanding the regulatory environment, maintaining client relationships, and recognizing patterns that might not be immediately obvious to someone without extensive experience in the field. A young man in the front row raised his hand. But isn't that just a matter of building better models? If we can capture all the variables in our algorithms, we shouldn't need to rely on subjective judgment. I smiled. That's exactly the kind of thinking that got us into this mess. Tell me, what happens when the model encounters a situation it hasn't been trained for? It should flag it as an anomaly and request human intervention. And what if the human doesn't have enough experience to recognize what type of anomaly it is? The room fell silent. I could see the wheels turning in their heads as they began to understand the gap between theoretical knowledge and practical experience. Risk management is as much art as science. I continued. The models and algorithms are tools, but they're only as good as the person using them. That's why client relationships matter, why institutional knowledge is valuable, and why experience can't be replaced by enthusiasm. Over the next few weeks, I began the process of rebuilding the risk management department. Some of the new hires were genuinely talented and eager to learn. Others were more interested in proving how smart they were than in actually solving problems. I kept the ones who showed promise and recommended that the others be moved to different departments. The first major test came when Henderson Industries requested a meeting to discuss their concerns about our risk assessment capabilities. They'd been one of my most important clients, and I knew they were looking for any excuse to take their business elsewhere. The meeting was scheduled for a Thursday afternoon, and I prepared extensively. I reviewed every aspect of their portfolio, researched their recent business developments, and prepared detailed responses to every possible concern they might raise. James Henderson, the company's CEO, arrived with his CFO and head of corporate development. I'd worked with James for 6 years, but I could tell he was skeptical about whether Meridian could still meet his company's needs. "Jessica," he said as we shook hands, "I have to admit, I was surprised to hear you were back. I thought you'd moved on to greener pastures." "I took a brief sabbatical," I said diplomatically, "but I'm back now. And I'm focused on making sure we continue to provide the level of service you've come to expect." We spent the next 2 hours going through their portfolio in detail. I walked them through the risk models we'd developed for their specific industry, explained how we'd adapted to the new regulatory environment, and showed them how our assessment methodology had evolved to address current market conditions. By the end of the meeting, James was smiling. "This is exactly what we needed to hear," he said. I was starting to wonder if Meridian still understood our business, but it's clear that you haven't lost your touch. "Yes, we're committed to maintaining the high standards we've always held ourselves to," I assured him. "Your business is important to us, and we're going to make sure you continue to receive the best possible service." As they were leaving, James pulled me aside. "Jessica, I don't know what happened here while you were gone, but I'm glad you're back. You've always been one of the most knowledgeable people in this business, and we value that expertise." After they left, I sat in my office and allowed myself a moment of satisfaction. Henderson Industries wasn't going anywhere, and I'd just saved Meridian from losing one of their biggest clients. The success with Henderson Industries was followed by similar meetings with other concerned clients. In each case, I was able to address their concerns and demonstrate that Meridian still had the expertise and experience they were looking for. Within 6 weeks, we'd managed to retain all of our major clients and even won back a few who had been considering leaving. But my real victory came when Morrison Financial Group reached out to discuss bringing their portfolio back to Meridian. They'd been dissatisfied with the service they'd received from Blackstone Associates and wanted to explore returning to their previous relationship with us. We made a mistake, their CEO admitted during our meeting. We thought we were getting the same level of service elsewhere, but it turns out that the personal relationships and institutional knowledge we had with Meridian can't be easily replaced. I wanted to tell him that was exactly what I'd been trying to explain to my former colleagues, but I kept my professional demeanor. We're always happy to welcome back former clients, I said, and we're committed to providing the level of service that made you want to work with us in the first place. The Morrison account was worth $60 million, and bringing them back was a major coup. Marcus was practically giddy when he heard the news, and David kept talking about how this would help their quarterly numbers. But the real satisfaction came from watching my former colleagues slowly realize what they'd lost when they'd forced me out. The bright young minds they'd brought in to replace me were talented, but they lacked the experience and relationships that had made me valuable in the first place. I began to rebuild those relationships systematically. I reached out to former contacts, renewed old friendships, and re-established myself as a trusted advisor in the industry. It didn't take long for word to spread that I was back at Meridian, and soon I was fielding calls from potential clients who had heard about my return. The irony wasn't lost on me. 3 months earlier, I'd been told I was too old and set in my ways to be valuable to the company. Now, those same qualities, my experience, my relationships, my institutional knowledge, were being hailed as irreplaceable assets. I also began mentoring some of the younger employees, teaching them not just the technical aspects of risk management, but the subtler skills that couldn't be learned from textbooks. I showed them how to read between the lines in client communications, how to recognize warning signs that might not show up in the data, and how to build the kind of trust that keeps clients loyal for decades. One of my protégés, a 26-year-old named Michael Torres, was particularly eager to learn. He'd been one of the new hires brought in to replace me, and he'd quickly realized that he was in over his head. I thought I knew everything about risk management when I started here, he admitted during one of our mentoring sessions. But I was just running numbers through formulas. I didn't understand the context, the relationships, the human element. That's not uncommon, I told him. The technical skills are important, but they're only part of the equation. The real skill is knowing when to trust the numbers and when to trust your instincts. How do you develop those instincts? Experience, mistakes, learning from people who've been doing this longer than you have, I smiled. And being humble enough to admit when you don't know something. Michael turned out to be one of my best students. He had the technical skills of his generation, but he was also willing to learn from my experience. Within a few months, he was handling complex client relationships with confidence and skill, but not everyone was as receptive to my return. A few of the younger employees resented having to answer to someone they'd been told was obsolete. They grumbled about outdated methods and resistance to change, apparently forgetting that their cutting-edge approaches had nearly cost the company over $100 million. One particularly arrogant analyst named Kevin Walsh made it clear that he didn't think I had anything to teach him. He'd graduated from a top-tier business school, had worked at 2 prestigious consulting firms, and apparently believed that his credentials trumped my experience. I don't understand why we're reverting to these legacy approaches, he said during one team meeting. We should be leveraging artificial intelligence and machine learning to optimize our risk assessment processes. AI and machine learning are useful tools, I agreed. But they're only as good as the data they're trained on, and they can't account for factors that aren't in their training sets. What happens when the AI encounters a situation it's never seen before? It learns from it and improves its algorithms. And what happens to the client whose portfolio gets destroyed while the AI is learning? Kevin didn't have an answer for that, but I could see he wasn't convinced. He continued to push for more automated approaches, apparently believing that technology could replace human judgment entirely. His attitude came to a head during a client presentation where he tried to override my recommendations with his own AI-generated analysis. The client, a conservative insurance company, was not impressed with his flashy charts and algorithmic predictions. This is exactly the kind of approach that makes us nervous, the client's CEO said after Kevin's presentation. We're not interested in being test subjects for experimental algorithms. We want proven methodologies and experienced judgment. After the client left, fortunately, without canceling their account, I had a private conversation with Kevin. You almost lost us a major client, I told him. Your AI analysis contradicted our established methodology without any explanation of why we should trust an algorithm over proven experience. The algorithm is more sophisticated than traditional risk models, he insisted. It can process more variables and identify patterns that humans might miss. And it can also make mistakes that humans would catch immediately. The client was right to be skeptical. They're not paying us to experiment with their money. Kevin's face flushed. So we're just supposed to stick with outdated methods because they're familiar? We're supposed to use the best tools available for each specific situation. Sometimes that's cutting-edge technology, sometimes it's experienced judgment, and sometimes it's a combination of both. The key is knowing which tool to use when. I could see that Kevin wasn't convinced, but he was smart enough to realize that challenging me further would be career suicide. He continued to work on the team, but he never quite got over his resentment at having to defer to someone he considered less technologically sophisticated. Meanwhile, my success at Meridian was attracting attention from other firms. Headhunters began calling, offering lucrative positions at competing companies. The same industry that had written me off as too old just months earlier was now courting me aggressively. One particularly interesting offer came from Sterling Capital Management, a boutique firm that specialized in high-net-worth clients. They wanted me to head up their risk management division and were offering a salary that was nearly double what I was making at Meridian. We've been following your work, their CEO told me during our initial conversation. The way you've turned around Meridian's risk management department has been impressive. We think you could do the same thing for us. I was flattered, but I wasn't ready to leave Meridian yet. I was enjoying the process of rebuilding the department, and I felt like I had unfinished business with the company that had tried to discard me. I appreciate the offer, I told him, but I'm committed to my current role for the foreseeable future. Well, if you change your mind, the offer stands. We're always looking for proven talent. The fact that I was being recruited by other firms didn't go unnoticed at Meridian. Marcus made a point of mentioning it during our next executive committee meeting. I hope you're not planning to leave us, he said, trying to sound casual. We've made a significant investment in rebuilding the risk management department around your expertise. I'm not planning to go anywhere, I assured him, but it's nice to know that my skills are valued in the marketplace. Marcus looked uncomfortable. Of course they are. We've always recognized your value. That's why we brought you back. I bit my tongue to keep from reminding him that just 6 months earlier, he told me I was too old and set in my ways to be valuable to the company. Instead, I smiled and said, I'm glad we were able to work things out. As the months passed, it became clear that my return to Meridian had been a complete success. The risk management department was performing better than ever. Client satisfaction was at an all-time high, and we were attracting new business at a rapid pace. The young team members I'd mentored were developing into skilled professionals, and even some of the initially resistant employees were beginning to appreciate the value of experience and institutional knowledge. The department had found a balance between cutting-edge technology and proven methodologies, using each approach where it was most appropriate. But perhaps the most satisfying moment came during the company's annual performance review cycle. Marcus called me into his office to discuss my evaluation, and I could see that he was struggling with how to address our history. Jessica, he began, I want to start by saying that your return to Meridian has exceeded all our expectations. The risk management department is performing at the highest level we've ever seen, and your contributions have been invaluable. Thank you, I said, waiting for the other shoe to drop. I also want to acknowledge that we made some significant errors in judgment regarding your departure. We were focused on the wrong priorities, and we failed to recognize the value you brought to the organization?" I almost laughed. This was as close to an apology as I was likely to get from Marcus, and even then, he couldn't quite bring himself to admit they'd been wrong about my age or capabilities. "I appreciate that," I said diplomatically. "Moving forward, we want to make sure that the company benefits from your expertise for years to come. We're prepared to offer you a permanent position as Senior Vice President of Risk Management, with a seat on the executive committee and a compensation package that reflects your value to the organization." The offer was generous, more than I'd ever expected to receive from Meridian. But I'd learned something important during my time away from the company and my return as a consultant. I didn't need their validation to know my worth. "That's a very generous offer," I said. "But I'm happy with my current consulting arrangement. It gives me the flexibility to work on my own terms, and it allows me to maintain relationships with other clients as well." Marcus looked surprised. "Are you sure? This would be a significant promotion, and the compensation would be substantial." "I'm sure, but I appreciate the offer, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to contribute to Meridian's success." As I left his office, I realized that I'd achieved something more valuable than revenge. I'd proven, to myself and to everyone else, that age and experience weren't liabilities to be discarded, but assets to be valued and nurtured. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on me. The company that had fired me for being too old had learned that youth and enthusiasm couldn't replace experience and wisdom. They'd paid a heavy price for that lesson, over $100 million in lost revenue and damaged relationships, but they'd learned it nonetheless. I continued my consulting work at Meridian, but I also began taking on projects with other firms. My reputation in the industry had been restored, and I was busier than ever. The same headhunters who had ignored me during my job search were now calling regularly with new opportunities. But more importantly, I'd regained my confidence and self-respect. I was no longer the discarded employee who wondered if she was too old and set in her ways. I was a skilled professional with valuable expertise, and I was finally being compensated appropriately for that expertise. The young employees I'd mentored were thriving, and several had been promoted to senior positions within the company. They'd learned not just the technical aspects of risk management, but the importance of relationships, experience, and institutional knowledge. They were carrying forward the lessons I'd taught them, and they were becoming the kind of well-rounded professionals that the industry needed. Kevin Walsh, the arrogant analyst who had challenged my methods, eventually left Meridian for a position at a fintech startup. I heard through the grapevine that he was struggling with the transition from the structured environment of an established financial services firm to the chaotic world of a technology startup. His algorithmic approaches weren't translating well to the real-world challenges of building a business from scratch. Meanwhile, Michael Torres, the young analyst who had been eager to learn, was promoted to Assistant Vice President of Risk Management. He'd developed into exactly the kind of professional the industry needed. Technically skilled, but experienced enough to know when to trust human judgment over algorithmic predictions. One day, about a year after my return, Michael stopped by my office with a question that made me realize how far he'd come. "Jessica, I've been thinking about the Morrison account," he said, settling into the chair across from my desk. "Their portfolio performance has been solid, but I'm seeing some patterns in their derivatives exposure that concern me. The algorithms aren't flagging it as a major risk, but something feels off." I smiled. "What kind of patterns?" "They're heavily weighted in energy sector derivatives, and while the current market conditions are favorable, I'm worried about their exposure if there's a significant shift in oil prices. The correlation models suggest they're within acceptable risk parameters, but your instincts are telling you something different?" "Exactly. I keep thinking about what you said about the 2008 crisis and how many firms got caught off guard because they were too focused on the models and not enough on the underlying economic fundamentals." I leaned back in my chair, impressed by his analysis. "So, what do you think we should do?" "I'd like to recommend some hedging strategies to reduce their energy sector exposure. It might cost them some upside potential, but it would provide protection against downside risk." "And if the algorithms are wrong about the risk level?" Michael grinned. "Then we'll have saved them from potentially catastrophic losses. And they'll thank us for our conservative approach. And if the algorithms are right and we're being overly cautious, then we'll have sacrificed some potential gains for peace of mind, and they'll still be better off than if we'd ignored the warning signs. I nodded approvingly. That's exactly the kind of thinking that separates good risk managers from great ones. You're learning to trust your judgment even when it contradicts the technology. Michael's success wasn't unique. Several other young professionals in the department had developed similar instincts. Learning to balance technological tools with human insight, they were becoming the next generation of risk management professionals, and they were significantly more well-rounded than their peers at other firms. The transformation of the risk management department became a case study that was discussed throughout the industry. Business schools began inviting me to speak about the integration of experience in technology and financial services. I found myself presenting at conferences, writing articles for industry publications, and consulting with other firms that were struggling with similar challenges. One particularly memorable speaking engagement was at a financial services conference in Chicago. The topic was Bridging the Generation Gap in Risk Management, and the audience was filled with executives who were grappling with the same issues that had led to my departure from Meridian. The financial services industry has a tendency to swing between extremes, I told the audience. We either embrace new technology completely, discarding proven methodologies in favor of the latest innovations, or we resist change entirely, clinging to outdated approaches that no longer serve our clients' needs. I clicked to the next slide, which showed a graph of Meridian's performance before and after my departure and return. The key is finding the right balance. Technology can enhance human judgment, but it can't replace it. Experience can provide valuable context, but it must be combined with current knowledge and innovative thinking. During the Q&A session, a young executive raised her hand. But how do you convince senior management to value experience when they're under pressure to cut costs and modernize their operations? I thought about my own experience, about the $100 million Meridian had lost by prioritizing cost-cutting over institutional knowledge. You show them the true cost of losing that experience, I said. It's not just about salary savings, it's about client relationships, regulatory knowledge, and the ability to recognize patterns that might not be immediately obvious to someone without extensive experience in the field. Another audience member, an older gentleman who looked to be in his late 50s, asked, "What advice would you give to someone who's been told they're too old to be valuable to their organization?" I paused for a moment, thinking about my own journey from despair to vindication. First, don't internalize their assessment of your value. Age discrimination is real, and it's not a reflection of your capabilities. Second, focus on what makes you unique: your experience, your relationships, your institutional knowledge. These are assets that can't be easily replaced, regardless of what anyone tells you. I looked around the room, making eye contact with several older attendees who seemed to be hanging on my every word. And finally, don't be afraid to take risks. Sometimes the best opportunities come from unexpected places. The company that discards you today might be the one that needs you tomorrow. After the conference, I was approached by several executives who wanted to discuss potential consulting opportunities. The demand for my services had grown beyond anything I'd imagined when I'd first returned to Meridian. But perhaps the most satisfying conversation was with a woman in her 40s who had been laid off from her position as a senior analyst at a major investment bank. "I've been out of work for 8 months," she told me. "Everyone keeps telling me I'm overqualified or that they're looking for someone with a different perspective." I was starting to think maybe they were right. Maybe I was too old to be competitive in this market. "What's your area of expertise?" I asked. "Municipal bonds. I've been working in that sector for 15 years, and I know the regulatory environment better than anyone. But apparently, that's not what employers are looking for anymore." I handed her my business card. "Send me your resume. I know several firms that are looking for exactly that kind of expertise. The challenge isn't that you're too old, it's that you're talking to the wrong people." 3 weeks later, she called to tell me she'd been hired as a senior vice president at a boutique firm that specialized in municipal finance. Her 15 years of experience had been exactly what they were looking for. and they'd been willing to pay a premium for her expertise. "You were right," she told me. "I wasn't talking to the right people. Thank you for helping me see that." Stories like hers became increasingly common as word spread about my work at Meridian and my advocacy for experienced professionals in the financial services industry. I began receiving calls from people who had been discarded by their employers and were struggling to find new opportunities. Some of them had skills that were genuinely outdated and needed to be updated. I helped them identify training programs and certification courses that would make them more competitive in the current market. Others had valuable expertise that wasn't being properly marketed. I helped them reframe their experience in terms that would resonate with potential employers. But all of them needed to hear the same message. Their age and experience were assets, not liabilities. If they could find the right opportunities and present themselves effectively, my consulting practice grew beyond what I'd ever imagined. I was working with firms across the country, helping them integrate experienced professionals with younger talent, and developing training programs that bridged the generational divide in the workplace. Meridian remained my primary client, but I was selective about the other projects I took on. I wanted to work with organizations that were genuinely committed to creating inclusive environments where professionals of all ages could thrive. One of my most successful projects was with a mid-sized insurance company that had been struggling with high turnover rates among their younger employees. They'd hired recent graduates who were technically skilled but lacked the industry knowledge to be truly effective. "We keep losing talented people after 6 months to a year," the CEO told me during our initial meeting. "They get frustrated because they feel like they're not making progress, and they leave for positions at other firms." "What kind of training and mentorship programs do you have in place?" I asked. "We have a standard orientation program, and we assign each new hire to a supervisor who's supposed to provide guidance." "And how experienced are these supervisors?" The CEO looked uncomfortable. "Well, we've had some turnover in our senior ranks as well. Most of our supervisors have been with the company for 3 to 5 years." I could see the problem immediately. They were asking people with minimal experience to train and mentor new employees, creating a cycle where knowledge wasn't being effectively transferred and institutional memory was constantly being lost. "What happened to your senior employees?" I asked. "We had some restructuring a few years ago. We offered early retirement packages to reduce costs, and a lot of our most experienced people took them." It was the same story I'd heard dozens of times. Companies cutting costs by eliminating experienced employees, then struggling with the consequences of losing institutional knowledge and mentorship capabilities. I spent 6 months working with the insurance company to develop a comprehensive mentorship program that paired experienced industry professionals with new hires. Some of the mentors were current employees who had survived the layoffs, while others were retirees who were brought back as part-time consultants. The results were dramatic. Turnover rates dropped by 60%, and employee satisfaction scores increased significantly. The new hires were developing skills much more quickly because they had access to experienced mentors who could provide context and guidance that couldn't be found in training manuals or online courses. "This has been transformational for our organization," the CEO told me at the end of the project. "We're seeing levels of employee engagement and performance that we haven't had in years." The success of the insurance company project led to similar engagements with other firms. I was developing a reputation as someone who could help organizations harness the value of experience while still embracing innovation and change. But my most satisfying project was much closer to home. Marcus approached me about developing a company-wide mentorship program at Meridian that would formalize the kind of knowledge transfer I'd been doing in the risk management department. "We're seeing the same patterns across the organization," he admitted. "Our younger employees are technically skilled, but they're missing some of the softer skills and industry knowledge that come with experience. We'd like to create a program that pairs them with more experienced professionals." I was intrigued by the opportunity to influence the entire organization, not just my own department. "What kind of structure are you envisioning?" "We're open to suggestions. We know what we've been doing isn't working, and we want to learn from your success in risk management." Over the next few months, I worked with the HR department to develop a comprehensive mentorship program that would be implemented across all departments. The program paired experienced professionals with newer employees, but it also included reverse mentoring components where younger employees could share their knowledge of new technologies and approaches with their more experienced colleagues. The program was voluntary, but the response was overwhelming. Nearly 80% of eligible employees signed up to participate, either as mentors or mentees. The feedback was consistently positive, with both groups reporting that they were learning valuable skills and developing stronger relationships with their colleagues. One of the most interesting aspects of the program was how it broke down the artificial barriers that had been created between different generations of employees. The older workers realized that their younger colleagues had valuable insights about technology and changing market conditions, while the younger employees gained appreciation for the depth of knowledge and experience that their senior colleagues possessed. The program was so successful that other companies began reaching out to learn about our approach. I found myself consulting with organizations across the country, helping them develop similar programs that leveraged the strengths of employees from different generations. But perhaps the most rewarding aspect of my work was the individual success stories. I received regular updates from people I'd helped, telling me about promotions they'd received, new opportunities they'd found, or challenges they'd overcome. Michael Torres, my former protege, was promoted to Vice President of Risk Management and was being recruited by several major firms. He'd developed into the kind of well-rounded professional that the industry desperately needed. And his success was a testament to the value of combining technical skills with experienced mentorship. The woman I'd helped find a position in municipal finance had been promoted to managing director and was now running her own department. She'd become a mentor to other experienced professionals who were struggling to find opportunities in the current market. Even Kevin Walsh, the arrogant analyst who had initially resisted my methods, had learned from his struggles at the fintech startup. He'd returned to traditional financial services with a new appreciation for the value of experience and institutional knowledge. But the most satisfying story was my own. 2 years after returning to Meridian as a consultant, I was busier and more successful than I'd ever been. I was earning more money, working with more interesting clients, and having a greater impact on the industry than I'd ever imagined possible. The company that had fired me for being too old had learned that age and experience were valuable assets that couldn't be easily replaced. They'd paid a heavy price for that lesson, but they'd learned it thoroughly. More importantly, I'd learned that my value wasn't determined by what others thought of me, but by what I could contribute to the organizations and people I worked with. Age wasn't a liability to be hidden, but an asset to be leveraged. The financial services industry was slowly beginning to recognize that the most successful organizations were those that found ways to combine the energy and innovation of younger employees with the experience and wisdom of their older colleagues. The companies that embraced this approach were outperforming those that continued to view age as a liability. I continued my consulting work, but I also began writing and speaking more frequently about ageism in the workplace and the value of experience in professional settings. My story had become a case study in resilience and the importance of recognizing and valuing the contributions of employees of all ages. The irony of my situation never lost its appeal. The company that had told me I was too old and set in my ways to be valuable had begged me to come back and was now paying me significantly more than they'd ever paid me as an employee. They'd learned that experience and institutional knowledge couldn't be easily replaced, and they were willing to pay a premium to retain access to those assets. But more than that, they'd learned that diversity of thought and experience was essential for success in a complex and rapidly changing industry. The bright young minds they'd brought in to replace me were talented, but they needed the guidance and mentorship that only comes with years of experience. As I looked back on my journey, I realized that being fired had been the best thing that could have happened to me. It had forced me to recognize my own value, to develop new skills and relationships, and to build a career that was more fulfilling and financially rewarding than anything I'd had before. The revenge I'd initially sought had evolved into something much more meaningful, a demonstration that age and experience were valuable assets that deserved to be recognized and compensated appropriately. I'd proven that the assumptions about older workers being obsolete or inflexible were not only wrong, but costly for the organizations that embraced them. And I'd shown that sometimes the best response to discrimination and dismissal isn't anger or litigation, but simply proving them wrong through success and excellence. The company that had discarded me had learned their lesson, and they were paying the price for their short-sighted decision every day. As I sat in my office, reviewing the contracts for my next consulting project, I smiled at the thought of how far I'd come. 2 years ago, I'd been a discarded employee, wondering if I was too old to be valuable. Today, I was a sought-after consultant with more opportunities than I could handle, and a reputation as one of the most knowledgeable professionals in my field. They'd fired me for being too old, but now they couldn't afford to be without me, and that was the sweetest revenge of all.